Before we jump into the rules and regulations surrounding cannabis banking, it's important to look at the basics. What is cannabis exactly? How have the political and social relationships with cannabis changed over the years? And where does cannabis currently stand in the eyes of the government? Let us get started. The cultivation and use of the cannabis plant is not a new phenomenon. In fact, evidence of cannabis use dates back to around 2700 BCE in China by Emperor Shen Nung, whose teachings and medical practices with the plant were passed down for generations by word of mouth before being recorded in a book on herbal remedies written around the 2nd century CE. Over time, the plant spread throughout Asia into Europe, and by the 16th century, Spanish and English settlers were bringing it across to the Americas. Within the United States, the cannabis plant has a long and complex history, with the first hemp law enacted in 1619. However, instead of a law banning the plant, which is more in line with what we see in the country today, this law actually required every farm in the colonies to plant hemp. At the time, hemp was a critical crop for the colonists, used for things like clothing, rope, paper, and even as a legal currency for some time in the colonies of Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. Hemp production eventually lost out in popularity to cotton, which provided a softer clothing option, but by that time, marijuana, as an extract of the hemp plant, was already commonly used in medicines and tinctures. It wasn't until around the 1920s that a more recreational use for marijuana began to develop, the practice of which was primarily introduced by Mexican immigrants. With the initial rise in the price of alcohol, followed shortly thereafter by prohibition, marijuana became a cheaper and more readily available alternative to drinking. Throughout the next decade or so, marijuana use became increasingly associated with Mexican immigrants, who the public resented due to the lack of jobs available during the Depression, and the lower class, who were often seen as perpetrators of crime and violence. With the social stigma of marijuana now tainted, it wasn't long until the government stepped in. History of the regulation of hemp and marijuana. Hemp, and by extension marijuana, was largely regulated as any other plant for many years in the U.S. And while the social stigma had taken a hit, it wasn't until the end of Prohibition that it came back into the legal and political spotlight. With alcohol no longer being banned, the focus shifted to marijuana. By the early 1930s, the drug was being outlawed in cities all over the country, and states quickly started following suit. By 1931, it had been banned in 29 states. Federally, the U.S. was hesitant to outlaw marijuana, partly due to the medicinal uses of the drug being used and researched, and also partly due to the lucrative business coming from the hemp plant at large.